In the fading light of September 1942, a heavy silence fell over the rolling fields of Michigan, broken only by the cynical whispers of the American press. For 18 grueling months, the world had watched as a massive industrial experiment unfolded near a small creek called Willow Run. $47 million had been poured into the earth, and an army of 42,000 workers had been mobilized, trained, and pushed to their limits. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the total output of this titan of industry was exactly one airplane. One solitary B-24 Liberator had managed to crawl off the assembly line and take to the skies. The newspapers were merciless, mocking the facility with the stinging nickname "Will It Run?" To the public, it looked like a monumental failure of American ambition. But behind the closed doors of the executive offices, a much deeper and more dangerous secret was being guarded. This was not just a story of a factory. It was a story of a clandestine operation that began with 240 men, a stained notepad from a luxury hotel, and a promise so outrageous that the elite of the aviation industry considered it a delusion. If you are fascinated by the hidden engineering marvels that fundamentally shifted the tide of World War II, ensure you are subscribed to this channel, where we strip away the layers of history that others overlook. To understand the magnitude of what was happening, we must travel back to January 1941, to the sun-bleached runways of San Diego, California. Charles Sorensen, the man known as Cast Iron Charlie, stood within the cavernous hangars of Consolidated Aircraft. As the chief lieutenant of the Ford Motor Company, Sorensen was a man who lived by the pulse of the assembly line. He had spent 36 years perfecting the art of mass production, helping Henry Ford turn the automobile from a luxury for the rich into a necessity for the masses. But as he watched the production of the B-24 bomber that day, his blood pressure began to climb. He didn't see a modern factory. He saw a scene from a bygone era. Workers were using surveyors' transits, the kind of tools used to map mountain ranges, mounted on the beds of pickup trucks, just to align the massive engines. It took 4 agonizing hours to attach a single engine to the wing. Each bomber sat on heavy steel fixtures, exposed to the corrosive salt air of the coast, on being built one individual piece at a time like a piece of handcrafted Victorian furniture. Beside Sorensen stood Edsel Ford, the 45-year-old president of the company and the only son of the legendary Henry Ford. Edsel was a man caught between two worlds. He had made this journey to California against his father's direct and formidable orders. Henry Ford, a man of stubborn pacifism, wanted nothing to do with the machinery of death. He had publicly opposed the First Great War, and he was prepared to fight against involvement in this one. But Edsel possessed a clarity of vision that his father lacked. He looked at the global horizon and saw the gathering clouds of a conflict that would demand aircraft not in the dozens, but in the tens of thousands. He knew that the artisanal methods of Consolidated Aircraft, which managed to produce only one bomber every few days, would lead to a national catastrophe. That evening, as the Pacific waves crashed against the shore, Sorensen locked himself in his room at the Coronado Hotel. He didn't have a drawing board or a team of draftsmen. He had only the silence of the night and a hotel notepad. He began to mentally dismantle the B-24, a complex beast of over 1 million parts, and reorganize its very essence into a linear flow of motion that the world of aviation had never dared to imagine. The silence of that 4 a.m. hour in the Coronado Hotel was the birthplace of a revolution. As Charles Sorensen stared at the hotel notepad, now covered in a chaotic web of calculations and skeletal diagrams, he wasn't just drawing a factory. He was inventing a new language for the sky. He had effectively broken the 67-foot-long, 18-ton B-24 Liberator into a series of manageable sub-assemblies. In his vision, the wings would be built in one section, the fuselage in another, and they would all flow like a river toward a final, monumental union. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, Edsel Ford had initialed the sketch. In that quiet breakfast meeting, two men had committed to building the largest single-roof factory in human history, despite the fact that Ford Motor Company had never successfully mass-produced a single piece of aluminum aircraft. But a sketch is not a factory, and a promise is not a plane. The aerospace establishment laughed openly at the car people from Detroit. To them, an airplane was a masterwork of art, requiring thousands of hand-fitted rivets and custom-shaved parts. They believed the precision required for flight was fundamentally incompatible with the soul-crushing speed of an assembly line. Sorensen, however, knew that to beat the artisanal traditions of the past, he needed more than blueprints. He needed intelligence. He launched an operation that would make the OSS jealous. He selected 240 of Ford's most brilliant tool and die makers, engineers, and floor foremen. Their mission was simple: go to San Diego and blend into the woodwork and learn every single secret of how a B-24 was put together. These weren't government agents. They were men with grease under their fingernails and a fanatical obsession with efficiency. When they arrived at Consolidated Aircraft, the tension was so thick it could be felt in the air. The aviation engineers looked at the Ford men like barbarians at the gate. Martin Chapin, one of the lead toolmakers in the group, later recalled how they were met with cold hostility. The Consolidated staff believed that if you stamped a part instead of hand-forming it, the plane would simply fall out of the sky. But the Ford spies didn't care about tradition. They walked through the hangars with calipers and notebooks, asking questions that made the craftsmen cringe. They found a landing gear pivot that was being held together by nearly 100 individual welds, each requiring a time-consuming X-ray. They looked at it and saw a nightmare. Within weeks, they had sent designs back to Michigan to have that entire assembly replaced by just 3 massive, high-precision castings. Back in Dearborn, the pressure was immense. 900 tool designers began working 24-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They discovered a terrifying reality. Consolidated Aircraft didn't actually have standardized blueprints. They had templates, master gauges, and the collective memory of senior mechanics. Every B-24 coming out of San Diego was slightly different from the one before it. For Ford, this was industrial heresy. They had to reverse engineer the entire bomber from scratch. Every day, Ford's engineering department generated 5 miles of technical drawings, 5 miles of paper that translated artistic craftsmanship into rigid, replicable manufacturing specifications. They were preparing to manufacture 30,000 individual metal stamping dies, a task of such complexity that it threatened to break the company's back before a single brick was laid at Willow Run. They were converting a handcrafted miracle into a mass-produced weapon of war, and the clock was already ticking toward a disaster no one saw coming. While the 240 engineers were deep in their technical reconnaissance in California, a different kind of war was beginning on a quiet stretch of farmland in Michigan. In March 1941, the tranquil air of Ypsilanti was shattered by the roar of diesel engines and the rhythmic thud of axes. 300 men descended upon Henry Ford's personal farm, a place where city boys from the Ford camps had spent their summers learning to plant corn and respect the soil. Within days, 100 acres of ancient forest were leveled. A steam-powered sawmill was erected on site, running non-stop to process 400,000 board feet of lumber. The scent of fresh sawdust and heavy exhaust filled the air where agriculture had once reigned. This was the birth of Willow Run. The men worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, and driven by a nameless urgency that preceded the official declaration of war. The man tasked with designing this industrial behemoth was Albert Kahn, the undisputed king of Detroit's industrial architecture. Kahn had designed masterpieces for Chrysler and Packard, but Willow Run was a challenge of a different order. The main structure was planned to cover 3.5 million square feet, a space so vast it possessed more floor area than the Empire State Building. However, a strange quirk of American bureaucracy dictated its final form. As Kahn laid out the mile-long assembly line, he realized that if the building continued in a straight line, it would cross the border into Wayne County, where taxes were significantly higher. In a move that was both brilliant and absurd, Kahn designed a sharp 90-degree turn on creating an L-shaped factory that kept the entire operation within the tax-friendly confines of Washtenaw County. To manage this, massive turntables were installed to rotate the heavy bomber fuselages mid-assembly, a mechanical ballet of 18-ton giants. Construction began in earnest on April 18, 1941. It was a feat of coordination that seemed impossible. 5 major contractors working simultaneously, building the factory in sections while workers moved in behind them to install machinery. Plywood partitions were used to separate the finished production zones from the active construction sites, where sparks from welding torches met the dust of rising concrete. The main structure was completed in a staggering 5 months. It was a testament to American will, yet as the dedication ceremony took place in October 1941, with Major Jimmy Doolittle in attendance, a hollow feeling lingered. The building was there, the speeches were made, and the cameras flashed, but the vast floor was empty. No machinery was calibrated, no workers were fully trained, and not a single B-24 had been built. Then came December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed Willow Run from a bold industrial experiment into a desperate necessity for national survival. Suddenly, the slow, methodical pace of setting up the line was no longer acceptable. The Grand Canyon of the mechanized world was now expected to produce miracles under the shadow of a global catastrophe. In April 1942, Charles Lindbergh arrived, driving nearly 1,000 miles without sleep to join the effort. What he found was a facility that looked like a temple of the future, but functioned like a chaotic nightmare. The transition from building cars to building complex 4-engine bombers was proving to be a brutal learning curve. The press, sensing blood in the water, began their relentless assault, and the pressure on Edsel Ford, already struggling with failing health, became almost unbearable. The dream of 1 bomber per hour felt further away than ever. As the summer of 1942 arrived, Willow Run was no longer just a factory. It was a sprawling, chaotic city of strangers struggling to find their rhythm. The human cost of this industrial miracle was becoming visible in the exhausted eyes of 42,000 workers. The plant was located 35 miles from the heart of Detroit, and in an era of strict wartime gasoline and tire rationing, the daily commute was a brutal endurance test. But the struggle didn't end at the factory gates. Housing in the area was practically non-existent. Workers were forced to rent rooms in shifts. As soon as one person rolled out of bed to head to the assembly line, another, finishing their midnight shift, would roll in. Landlords, driven by greed, collected double and triple rent for these hot beds. Families lived in converted chicken coops and abandoned gas stations and flimsy shacks built from scrap lumber and cardboard. It was a landscape of desperation, yet every morning the gates swallowed an army of people determined to build the wings of victory. Among this army was a new and revolutionary force. 12,000 women who had stepped out of kitchens and retail stores into the thunderous heart of heavy industry. They were the real life, Rosie the Riveters. Women like Betty Walters Robinson, once a beautician, found themselves wielding heavy hammers to secure waterproof crates for overseas parts. Helen Mast, who had spent her life selling elegant footwear, now wore steel-toed boots that felt like lead weights. The work was grueling and dangerous. In the most cramped sections of the B-24's wings, spaces where no average adult could fit, Ford recruited midgets and people of short stature. These individuals, many from the world of entertainment, crawled into the dark, suffocating aluminum tunnels to buck rivets, performing a task that was physically impossible for anyone else. They were the unsung ghosts inside the machine, working in shadows so that the Liberator could take flight. However, the rapid expansion of the workforce brought a terrifying new problem. Quality control was collapsing. In the rush to meet impossible quotas, parts that should have been scrapped were being installed. The "Will it run" mockery from the press was beginning to look like a prophecy. This was when Charles Lindbergh, the man who had once conquered the Atlantic, stepped in with a cold, unrelentless focus. He understood a truth that the bureaucrats ignored. Every bomber was a flying coffin if it wasn't perfect. He helped form an elite engineering quality team that inspected every single weld and every one of the 300,000 rivets. If a component wasn't flawless, the entire line stopped. Production slowed to a crawl, and the tension between the speed-obsessed managers and the quality-obsessed engineers reached a breaking point. The workers knew the stakes were personal. Many had sons, brothers, and husbands training to fly the very planes they were building. There is a story of a woman on the night shift who spent months riveting wing sections, her mind always on her son, a B-24 pilot whose location was a military secret. She worked with a fanatical precision, and wondering if her own hands were crafting the wings that would carry him home. One Thursday in 1944, a telegram arrived. He had been shot down over Germany. The factory floor went silent as the news spread, but the next evening she was back at her station. She picked up her riveting gun and continued her work, her face set in stone. She knew that even if her son was gone, other mothers' sons were still up there, and they needed her wings to be perfect. This was the soul of Willow Run, a place of 42,000 personal wars fought against time, death, and the crushing weight of grief. The tide finally turned in the early months of 1943. Like a massive, slumbering beast finally waking up, the assembly line at Willow Run began to move with a rhythmic, unstoppable precision. The numbers told a story of industrial vengeance. 31 bombers in January, 70 in February, and nearly 100 by March. The skepticism of Congress and the mockery of the press began to evaporate, replaced by a stunned silence. By March 1944, the impossible happened. Willow Run achieved the vision Charles Sorensen had scratched onto a hotel notepad 3 years earlier. The plant produced 453 bombers in just 458 working hours. It was the 1 bomber per hour miracle. In that single year, the output of this one factory in Michigan nearly equaled the entire aircraft production of the Empire of Japan. The cost of a B-24 plummeted from $238,000 to $137,000 not because of cut corners, but because Ford had finally mastered the geometry of mass destruction. But the victory was bitter for the men who had birthed the giant. Edsel Ford, the visionary who had defied his father to build the plant, never lived to see the 1 bomber per hour peak. He died in 1943 at the age of 49, his health broken by the relentless stress of the project and the psychological toll of fighting his father's isolationism. Charles Sorensen, the mechanical genius behind the layout, was pushed out in a corporate power struggle shortly after. Even Charles Lindbergh, who had found redemption within the factory walls, eventually left to fly 50 combat missions in the Pacific, often escorting the very B-24s he had helped make safer. These men were the architects of a miracle they were not permitted to enjoy, yet their legacy was etched into every rivet of the 8,685 aircraft that rolled off that line. The scale of the operation at its peak was almost incomprehensible. The cafeteria fed 42,000 workers daily, consuming more food than entire divisions of the German army. Security was so tight that the FBI maintained a constant presence, wary of the Nazi spies who had already been caught trying to infiltrate Detroit's industry. The B-24 Liberator itself was a masterpiece of complexity. 18 tons of aluminum held together by over 300,000 rivets. These planes became the workhorses of the global conflict, hunting U-boats in the Atlantic and bombing oil refineries in Romania. Their 3,000-mile range made them the dominant force in the vast stretches of the Pacific. Willow Run had produced half of all the Liberators ever built, turning the tide of the war not with a single battle, but with the sheer, crushing weight of American productivity. On June 28, 1945, the last bomber rolled off the line. The war in Europe was over. The end in Japan was weeks away. The mechanical river simply stopped flowing. Ford chose not to keep the plant, and over the following decades it passed through the hands of Kaiser Frazer and General Motors, producing automobiles and transmissions where bombers once stood. In 2010, the Grand Canyon of the mechanized world finally went silent when GM declared bankruptcy. Most of the structure was demolished, leaving only a small fragment saved by the Yankee Air Museum. Today, people drive past on Interstate 94, oblivious to the fact that they are passing the site of a human miracle. They don't know that 42,000 people once worked around the clock to build the impossible. The Grand Canyon took millions of years to form, but Willow Run built its legend in just 3. It stands as a reminder that when human effort, engineering brilliance, and a common cause align, there is no limit to what can be achieved. Thank you for watching this journey through history. Don't forget to subscribe to help us keep these stories alive.